Are you a history enthusiast looking for another new podcast? Dive deep into the captivating stories of Canada's past with a Historia Canadiana, as their hosts Patrick and Mackenzie work through this nation's history in a different and approachable fashion. Historia Canadiana unravels fascinating figures and pivotal events that have shaped the Great White North through a literary lens to offer listeners a richer understanding of Canada's heritage. Subscribe to the Historia Canadiana podcast, where history comes alive.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about history, culture, and society in this snowy land that we call Canada. Today on the show, I have two very interesting guests, Phil Lind and Robert Brehl, who are here to talk about a new book that they co-wrote, Tales of an Unsung Sourdough, The Extraordinary Klondike Adventures of Johnny Lind. So, a few introductions in this case. Phil Lind is the vice chairman of Rogers Communications, and for 40 years was the right-hand man of the company founder, the late Ted Rogers. Lind is a longtime supporter of the University of British Columbia, where he has invested in many areas of scholarship. Lind has also been inducted into the Order of Canada and the Cable Hall of Fame in Denver, Colorado. Robert, on the other hand, is an award-winning journalist, formerly of the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail, who operates his own consulting, communications, and writing firm called ABC2 Communications. He is the co-author of best-selling book Hurricane Hazel, A Life with Purpose, which was co-written with Mississauga's famed former mayor, Hazel McCallion. And together with Lind, Robert has co-authored Right-Hand Man, How Phil Lind Guided the Genius of Ted Rogers, which was a finalist of the National Business Book Award. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So I would like to start off with obviously a bit of a broader question in this case, and I'll direct this one at Phil in particular. Can you actually describe this particular book, Tales of an Unsung Sourdough, for those of us who might not have necessarily an awareness of what it is?
Well, I guess it's kind of a cross between a coffee table book and an adventure novel. Because both are true, very, very true. It's coffee-side because the pictures are magnificent, but yet we set a lot of text in there that's very, very insightful. So that's how we put it together that way.
Interesting.
May I add one thing, Patrick?
I was just about to say, go ahead.
Yeah, when you mentioned in the opening that we co-wrote Phil's autobiography, Right-Hand Man, I think this book came out of writing that because all of a sudden Phil started talking about his grandfather, Johnny Lind, and his adventures in the Klondike. And Phil can say one way or the other, but I think he saw my jaw drop and I was going, what? Like, I just couldn't believe everything he was telling me. And then he handed over his journal that he had written when he was back in the 1890s. And then some descendants had typed it all up and it was unpublished. And the tales inside there were just mind-blowing. And I said to Phil, we should do a book on him and his legacy because it's so fascinating.
Absolutely. And just for a bit of context in this case, and Robert, you can continue if you want, or Phil, you can pick up on this question if you feel like it. So can either of you explain, just for listeners, what the Klondike Gold Rush was, and just to provide a bit of context for it and why it's important to Canadian history? Well,
it's very important to Canadian history. The Klondike Gold Rush occurred in 1892, 94. This was a strike of unparalleled wealth in a little place called, well, there wasn't a place called Dawson because it didn't exist. It was in the Yukon, just south of Alaska. My my grandfather and a few others had been prospecting for gold in the
Franklin Gulch.
area, but in Alaska, no one had really struck. And there was a little territory below that there was some First Nations people and very little else. I mean, the Yukon was not really very much, and certainly not. No one knew anything about it. But when the strike hit, my God, 100,000 people, mainly Americans, headed up to those parts, and the Wild West was on. Boy, it was really something. I mean, and sleepy little Dawson. Wow! All of a sudden, wham!
If I can add, Patrick, like the strike happened in August of 1896, but the outside world, didn't know anything about it until July of 1897. So 11 months later, in our world, with instant messaging, with texting, it's almost unfathomable that it would take 11 months. Phil's grandfather, as he said, he just happened to be over in Franklin Gulch in Alaska, about 100 miles away. And by coincidence, at Christmas 1896, he went into 40 Mile for supplies. And all of a sudden, the place was deserted. And they said, "What's going on?" And they told him about the strike. So he and his partner, Skiff Mitchell, they had, was it 11,000 feet of cut wood back in Franklin Gulch that they said, "We're just going to have to leave it there. And we're going to go to Klondike." And it was a great move. By the time they got there, everything was staked. But they had some money, and they would be buying up pieces of other staked ground, because you have to remember, a lot of the guys who staked the ground, they were, by pure luck, they were in the bar when George Carmack came in to announce this big strike. So they all went out there. Well, they had come from California, from Utah, from Colorado. They were not used to this environment where routinely minus 50 degrees, whether Fahrenheit or Celsius, the two meet at that time. The bitter cold, just getting to the place, 600 miles of poling and paddling of rafts up the Yukon River, all this stuff. So a lot of these guys said, "You know what? Sure, I'll take your 10,000 or your 50,000 or whatever it was. I'm out of here. I just can't take it anymore." So that's basically how Johnny Lind and his partners built up their business, correct, Phil?
Yep, they got started that way. They had gold because there was some in Alaska. They had experience, which is better than anybody else had, and experience both with the weather and experience in placer gold mining, which is very different than other forms of mining. You dig in 40 and 50 below zero weather and you set a fire, and it warms maybe 2 or 3 inches of dirt, and you push that into the big pot, a big pile, and you set the fire for the next night. It was horrible. I mean, just absolutely horrible conditions that these guys had to endure, especially in the first couple of years.
And really like that emphasis on people not having necessarily the experience for this that both of you bring up. I know this is something that my co-host usually on the show, Mackenzie, who's worked actually near Dawson City before, was saying, it's like a lot of the people just didn't know. They went there for the lure of gold, but got smacked in the face by these absolutely harsh conditions that Phil, you just brought up, and Bob, that you were mentioning just before. And I also want to mention as well, or highlight another thing that was said in this case that I think is really important for listeners to keep in mind, is this kind of last Wild West, in a sense, that the Klondike was. And I think that's a really good image for people to keep in mind of this rush towards this final frontier, so to speak, as far as North America was concerned, which I think, those harsh conditions and the Wild West are two very important images that we can remember as we go forward with this conversation.
And I think the fact that they were this almost all Americans descending on this little Canadian area, they thought naturally that it would just be like the United States, but because there was a trail mark that comes in, they had to walk in over the Chilkoot Pass. They had to pass Canadian customs there, and the Mounties had set out, and they were. That was the first example, but even when they lived like Americans, but they had to abide by laws in Canada, which they most of them didn't really like, but they had to do it.
Absolutely.
Phil, just to add, the in Dawson, for the 3 to 5 year period after the strike, July 4th was a bigger celebration than July 1st, then known as Dominion Day, not Canada Day. And it was very, very, the cultural differences between the US and Canada. We tend to think we're very similar to Americans, and we are, but we're also very, very different. It was, as you said, that Wild West. In fact, Friedrich Trump, the grandfather of the US president, he started his fortune with brothels and saloons and gambling halls, not in Dawson, but on the way to Dawson. And it was rough country, and there was a miner's code. And if you broke the miner's code, the code would be, you can use somebody else's cabin, just leave it clean, leave some kindling so that they can get the fire started. But if they did anything, like there was one guy who stole some bacon, he was starving, stole some bacon. He got told, tomorrow you've got to leave. And they sent him off with 2 weeks provisions, never heard from him again. So it was just rough justice, really rough justice. And one last thing, the sourdough, people might not understand the significance of it. Sourdough.
That was my next question.
Okay, sourdough that began in San Francisco. Sourdough bread began in San Francisco during the 1849, 1850s gold rush. And as each gold rush developed, whether Colorado, Utah, British Columbia, all the way up to Alaska and the Yukon, the miners, the colder it got, they would keep the leaven, the starter, in a capsule that they'd hang around their chest on a necklace to keep it warm, so that they could make their bread. And you weren't allowed to call yourself a sourdough until you had spent 1 full year in Dawson, or in Yukon, actually.
That's really interesting. I like it. It's like a badge of honor, so to speak, for this particular place. Yeah, I really like that idea. I had never heard of the term a sourdough in reference to, in this case, we generally refer to the people in the Yukon as stampeders when they were going towards there. But yeah, that term sourdough was a first for me when I read this book, and I was like, that's really cool. That was one of my favorite parts of the book. I don't know if you had anything to add, Phil, to what was just said before I move on to the next question.
No, but the nomenclature was interesting. Chichaco was a rookie, was a person who just arrived there. If you're a Chichaco, you don't know nothing, as they say.
Excellent. So getting a bit into some of the details of the book in this case. So obviously your focus on or both of you focus on the life of Johnny Lind, or at least as a prospector in this case. And can either of you or both of you, tell me one particular event in Johnny's life in the Yukon that you find really exemplifies his time there and why that particular moment is interesting.
Can we each give one? Because I know Phil's
Sure,
will be different than
please.
mine.
Which
Please.
one were you on, Bob?
I'm on the getting their supplies in
Okay.
1894.
I'll take Edna.
So he's arrived there. They're in Franklin Gulch. It's late December. They have to get their supplies for the winter. So they take their sleds. There's only one dog per sled. And they go into 40 Mile. They get their supplies. They head back. And it's a 10-day journey back. Even though the rivers are frozen, it still took 10 days. And you have to imagine, in late December, there was no real sunlight. There was dusk from about 10 a.m. till about 3 p.m. or 2 p.m. or whatever. So they would travel with their dogs they get up in the morning, pitch black, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, and then they would go until the dusk had ended, and they'd have time to pitch their tent or pitch their camps, and wasn't a tent, for the next day. Well, their tents consisted of blankets and spruce branches over them. Imagine. And he said that the temperature was minus 50 every night. They couldn't even eat their bacon because they couldn't cut it with their axes. That was so frozen. So when I would read that, and I was, oh my God. But Phil, you tell yours, because I know which one you're going to say.
Well, it's a story, a very interesting story. The grandfather and a couple of guys were going into camp. And it was all dark and foreboding, naturally. And they came across a cabin with a light on, with one of those lamp lights. And they looked in, and there was a woman who was in labor, and what had happened was her husband had gone up to get some medical relief, and they delivered the baby, and these three or four miners had no concept whatsoever how this was going to work, boiling water, etc., etc. And then they were stumped. They had to, what are they going to feed this kid? And anyway, they got this baby out into civilization, and no one could believe it. I mean, two or three miners delivering a baby and feeding it until such time as feeding it rum, by the way. They had rum, feeding it rum until help arrived.
Incredible.
And this girl was called out, when they called her Edna El Dorado, and it was just a miracle.
I remember I spoke to a well, it's not a bush pilot, but I remember speaking to someone who's a pilot in the north with a similar story of encountering a child who was born in these particular conditions, right? And it's mind-boggling how, as Bob was saying before, like surviving, first of all, in minus 50 is something that I can't even conceive of, right? Because I get cold at 20 degrees here in Montreal, so surviving minus 50 in the Yukon is not even conceivable. But on top of that, adding children or childbearing in this is something that adds a layer of dread, but also, as you say, like it adds a sense of wonder to the human condition of being able to survive these particular
Yes.
conditions in the way that you're describing, Phil. And I really like that story for that reason of what it tells us about resilience in some really fascinating ways. So yeah, thank you very much, both of you, for sharing that. Um, and a bit of a similar question, but I would say the other side of the coin in this case. I'm always interested in the behind the scenes of a book. And I'm curious if there's anything that didn't make it into the book as far as stories of Johnny Lind are concerned, and what those particular stories were like. And again, both of you, if you have an example, that's fantastic, or something that didn't quite make it into it.
I'll go first. My grandfather left London, Ontario at age 16, grade 8 education, to pursue his fortune. And he worked his way west on the American Western railroads. John J. Hill, also from Woodstock, who was based then in Minnesota, St. Paul. And he worked his way out west. And he spent several years getting there.
Or a decade.
Yeah. And none of that. And well, then he went, his partner, he ended up in Tacoma, spent a lot of time in Missoula, Montana, and then decided, this is in a whim, shall we go to Venezuela for oil, or shall we go to Alaska for gold? And Alaska turned up.
They flipped the coin.
Yeah. Can you imagine?
No.
Like, Alaska came up, fortunately for them, good. But they were, but the one thing about saying about his work in railway construction, he really knew how to fit things together. And so there was no Checo in Johnny Lind. When by the time he was in Alaska, he'd already done a lot of the construction that was needed up there.
If I could jump in, that's the one thing, Patrick, that as I was reading his Klondike journals and then his recollections years later and stuff, there was very, very little about his decade or so on the railroad. He was an incredibly self-taught man. He was basically an engineer without the ring. He was building bridges and things like that. And he was a young kid, and he had, was it 200 men? His crew grew to 200 men on the railroad. But that's the only thing. There was the letters that he wrote home, they disappeared with time, and there wasn't nearly the record of those years that there were of the 5 or so years up in the Yukon.
Absolutely. Yeah. And something that we're kind of gravitating around that I want to kind of add as a question in this case. So we're talking about Johnny as someone who participated in the gold rush in this case, but what do you feel like this particular perspective or his particular perspective adds to our overall understanding of the gold rush? Does it change our perspective on it in any way, or does it add an element to our understanding of the gold rush that perhaps the average person doesn't necessarily imagine when they think of the Yukon gold rush?
Well, there's one or two factoids that have changed, I think, over the years. Certainly, who discovered gold? The stories out there at the time were George Carmack's, because he was an American and a big shot and liked buying drinks. So he discovered gold. But in fact, he was near Bob Henderson, who probably came as close to finding it as but he was with his sister, his wife, who was Native, and his brother or brothers-in-law. So Quiche was the actual discoverer of gold. But it didn't make any sense in those days. So why not make it?
Well, and Phil, in fact, George Carmack went out of his way for 2 or 3 decades to promote himself as the true discoverer. And I remember the first time I read Johnny Lynn's recollections that he wrote in the early 1930s, in the midst of the Depression. He starts talking about how Kish was the real discoverer, and George Carmack was a blowhard. And this is the 1930s. If you go online now to the Canadian Encyclopedia, plug in Klondike, and I believe it did when I was writing the book, and I think they haven't changed it. It says Carmack was a discoverer, but most historians know it wasn't Carmack; it was Kish.
Absolutely.
So I'm pretty proud of his grandfather, that he was so far ahead of the times, and he was not afraid to step outside the boundaries and say, you know what, here's the truth.
But they treated the First Nations people very badly. Of course, they always did. Not as badly as America, but they moved them down, moved them away from the what were going to be a white settlement and things like that. So the story of the First Nations people is really not being properly told yet.
Absolutely. It's something that's starting to change, I feel, in Canadian historiography. And, the idea that we can know that Carmichael, as we were saying, is not necessarily the discoverer is one of those things that helps contribute to this kind of reshaped narrative. But yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done. But I do appreciate these new perspectives on this, on who discovered the gold and so on, that I think are invaluable to our understanding of Canadian, but also just North American history in general. So very appreciated in that sense.
The other thing is, because I'm sort of a North American sociologist by training, the profound differences between how those Americans acted in Canada versus how the Americans acted 2 miles south of that, is very, very interesting. Fortunately, we didn't have an armed rebellion or anything like that up there. Fortunately, everybody was more or less well behaved. But in Soapy Smith and in neighboring Skagway, I mean, it's just they ripped people off all the time. They stole, they killed them. It was amazing differences between living in Dawson as opposed to Skagway, or later as opposed to Dawson and Nome, Alaska. There is a huge, profound difference between the two countries and the way they see the world.
Absolutely. Bob, did you have anything to add before I moved on to the next question? Or
well, there's some numbers that I kind of like that paint a nice picture. When you say the significance of the Klondike on historical significance, roughly 100,000 people, an estimated 100,000 people, stampeded. About 40,000 actually got to the gold fields. The others, too many perished, and a lot turned back. And of those 40,000, it was only 400 or 500 who actually discovered gold, and only about 40 or 50 significant amounts, and who left with their fortune. And Johnny Lynn was one of them. There were many examples. One of my favorite examples is it was a black man from Georgia who was a slave. And in 1863, when emancipation took place, he was free. He wandered around the continent. He ends up in Alaska, and then he ends up over in Dawson. St. John Atherton apparently had $40,000 or $50,000 fortune at the time, which would be 30 times that. You do the math. He left went back to Georgia, bought the plantation where he had been a slave, and the daughter of the owner, when he was there as a young man, the owner was dead, and the daughter was now the plantation was not making money, and the banks were going to foreclose. So he bought it and allowed her, his slave master's daughter, to live the rest of her life in her home, which is quite something.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting parts of the book, I feel, is the way in which you incorporate kind of memorabilia from the gold rush in this case. That we'll talk a little bit more about where that memorabilia is going and so on. But this collection is quite extensive and was brought about by Johnny and other people. But how did you come across this collection? Was it something that was part of the family that was kind of inherited, or was it brought about in various ways? Can you tell us a little bit more about this collection and
Well, the
how it was
collection,
formed?
I think the collection starts with me. My father had a dozen or 24 books that were Alaska Klondike, but I really went into it in depth. Because I was in the West Coast a lot, and B, because it fascinated me. And eventually I developed a series of pickers too, so they would go and things from Calgary or from Victoria or from mainly Seattle, Portland, San Francisco. And that's how the collection started, because I didn't have the time to do everything to find all these treasures, but there are guys that do. So then they sell them to book dealers and whatever. So that's how this collection was amassed. There are very few like it in I think there's one in Fairbanks for sure. And then I think the collection ended up, one of them ended up in UW in the University of Washington, another one in San Francisco. But they're are few and far between.
Sorry about that. I was just taking a drink of water. Yeah, but it's very interesting. Like, obviously you include a bunch of pictures in the book, which I think are fascinating. One that I really can't stop looking at is the one of a man whose face is basically frozen with all kinds of snow and in his beard and all that, which I've never seen or rarely seen that level of ice on a person's face and that person still be alive. And that for me is like absolutely hilarious to think about. But just to give a sense, right, we're talking here about diaries and pictures, maps, all of these things that for the most part is quite inaccessible to a lot of people, or are maintained in collections, as you were saying, in particular universities, which is obviously good in some senses, but to have many of these materials reprinted in the book, I think, is a really interesting choice, and one that's particularly valid for our more complete understanding of the gold rush in a material sense. And yeah, Bob, was there anything you wanted to add about this particular collection, or perhaps its importance or anything of the sort?
Well, I think once it's up and running, it won't just be, it's being housed in the main library at the University of British Columbia, but a lot of it has been digitized. A lot of the brochures, a lot of pictures, they've all been digitized. So some researchers won't have to be in Vancouver, although I imagine that once it's opened, and it's anticipated to open later this year, there will be a significant number of Klondike aficionados and researchers who will just gather there, I would think.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that digitization process, because it's something that's still surprisingly not as frequent as one might expect, at least as far as the archives are concerned in Canada. And that the University of British Columbia is actually digitizing a lot of these, if not all of it, I'm not sure, then that's really a major step, as you're saying, for the universalization or the wider dissemination of these really invaluable products and collections, right?
And they don't they don't fade further. I mean, all of these photos, especially stereographs, all of these things are on their last legs.
Now, Patrick, Phil wouldn't say this, but I will. And that is, besides donating the collection, he donated a significant amount of money that helped pay for things like the digitization and the storage that will be in perpetuity. I think you wanted to initially donate it to Dawson, but they just didn't have the facilities to store it for a long time.
No, I played around with Dawson for a little bit, but it's so small. It's 150 people at the maximum. You can't. They just don't have the resources to supervise and to make sure that it's all hunky dory. So and then we moved to Whitehorse, and you could give to the federal government, but God knows where that would end up. So the trail logically led to a university in Canada, right? And UBC, because I'm sort of familiar with everything at UBC, I gave it there.
And in what ways, because obviously you've been referencing the diaries a lot, or the actual written record for the way that you researched this book and wrote about it. And in what ways did you use the memorabilia, right? The pictures and the maps. How were those elements incorporated into the writing and way that you approached the subject matter of this particular, if you could speak a little bit more about that?
It's an interesting question because there's so many photos, there's so much stuff that people have never seen, or people in this age have never seen anything like it. No, I think mainly the stories was key, and then the pictures surrounded it. It wasn't a question of, oh wow, look at this, and we'll make a little sort of. I mean, the history, the narrative of the Yukon is so fascinating. Starting with Pierre Burton's book, I mean, you just cannot close the book. I mean, it's just one dazzling thing after another. I mean, Charlie Anderson was a hunchback from Sweden, won in a poker match a claim, and he said, "What do I do with it?" He went back the next day, begged him to take it back. No, you own it. He went down there. He did his limited prospecting, and he ended up with over $1 million at that time.
That's 30 million today.
Yep.
And then, of course, because like everyone else, they had a propensity to spend and spend and spend, because there was so much of everything that about 2 years later, Charlie was broke again, and he worked for my grandfather. I mean, it's just incredible how much money these guys had, and flew out of their hands like it was no tomorrow, because they thought that the pile they were building on for the next year's run would be as good as this year's, and it wasn't. It was an incredibly rich strike, but an incredibly small area, two small puff creeks in El Dorado, and yeah, and that's all it was. I mean, there was gold sprinkled, everywhere, and there's still gold. I mean, my God, there's lots of gold mining up there now, but for these prospectors and how they could do it was a very limited, but a very, very rich claim. I mean, Bob, he told us, he read the story about a guy in town one night, $50,000 on one hand. In those days, what would that be in today's?
$1.5 million.
Exactly.
And a hand, a poker.
Well, sorry, the guy you mentioned, the humpback Swede, Charlie Anderson, he would bathe in champagne because he could.
I'm laughing, but it's madness, right?
Yeah.
There's no way that that's normal behavior. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
These guys were poor when they went up, and 99% of them were poor when they came back.
There you go.
But they had a hell of a time, the ones that survived.
Exactly. And yeah, Robert, did you want to add anything to this as far as the importance of the memorabilia was concerned to the way that the story was built? That was the original question.
Well, the only thing I would add would be that Phil lent me dozens of the books. I skimmed through, and well, actually, some Tappan Adney. There's a name that people don't know today, but he wrote some of the best early stuff. Jack London wrote some great stuff too, based on his time there. Jack London almost died up there of scurvy. He was very close to death. But Tappan Adney, my God, there was one point where he talks about a guy who's on the trail dead, and he finds his letter, his suicide letter or his goodbye letter or something, and he said something like, hell or damnation can't be worse than this. I'm taking my chances. And he hung himself or shot himself. I can't remember how he did it, but it was just an incredible story. Day after day, people perished, people who partied.
Absolutely. And again, to kind of emphasize the importance of donating this particular or giving this particular collection to the University of British Columbia, just the way that both of you are speaking about it indicates just how much there's still to be said about this particular event, right? You use just a fraction of the pictures and maps and stories, and all of this can continue to inspire stories in the future by both researchers and perhaps other types of cultural creators in this case. And I just want to emphasize that point again, because I don't think it can be made enough, that there's just so much here that hasn't been explored that can still be. Yeah, Phil, you look like you wanted to say something.
Well, and I'm still amassing collection here, so every 2 or 3 years it goes sent up to. So it's an ongoing thing, although frankly, less and less so. I mean, less and less. Lots of really good books written on the Klondike now, but less and less materials that can be found from those days.
If I can add one last thing, Patrick, Phil's grandfather, until this book, he wasn't featured in any books, and he was mentioned in less than a handful. 3, Phil? 3 or 4 maybe? And in fact, Pierre Burton, in his famous book, he gives significant space to Johnny's partner, Skiff Mitchell, and talks about his El Dorado #1, that claim there, all that sort of stuff. But he never mentions Johnny Lind. So to me, one of the best parts of this project and Phil's collection and donating the collection is that he has now left a legacy for his grandfather, so that anybody from now on who does anything on the Klondike, the name Johnny Lind is bound to pop up one way or another. And I think he was a humble man and quite remarkable man in so many ways.
And I want to finish off with a few questions on the actual writing process in this case, because this is not the first time that you two collaborate on a book, as I mentioned in the introduction. So what was that collaboration like for this particular text? Like how did you work in conjunction? What was the process behind that? And yeah, just any thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
Well, the motivation, the spark was Bob's. I mean, I was so concerned about a right-hand man and Ted Rogers and my life with him, that I would do this Johnny Lind stuff was just interesting, very interesting, but it was a minor family story. But Brehl kept saying, "No, Phil, this is really interesting stuff," and that's how the thing got going.
So we would sit around and we'd be at his condo talking about how we want to do this and all this sort of, and then spontaneously Phil would just start talking about different things. He'd start talking about the stories he heard from his mother and his father, from his grandfather's funeral, where from the cement plant, that St. Mary's Cement, that he used the money from the Klondike to help start St. Mary's Cement, and these people who would show up in their dusty overalls at his funeral, who were just weeping because they loved the man so much. He was such a good employer, almost a friend to so many of them.
Never let anyone go during
the Depression. Yeah. And so as part of your question, Patrick, that's how the parts of the book where Phil says, things like, I found out that my grandfather was taken by the beauty of British Columbia as soon as he arrived. I was like that in the 1960s when I went to school there. Or there's personal reflections of Phil all through the book, sprinkled through the book. So that's, I would do the research and do the writing. Phil would review the writing. We'd talk about different things. So that's pretty much the process. Right, Phil?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that was one of the interesting parts of reading the book, was exactly that kind of balance between personal and more academic almost research in this sense. And I feel you can see this right from the opening pages, right? Where you say, in St. Mary's, Ontario, they were attending the funeral of John Grieve Lind in St. James Anglican Church, a Victorian era stone edifice. None knew him from his years in the north, but many had heard his Klondike tales and knew how the cold, rugged place shaped him into a warm-hearted man with a genuine soft spot for those less fortunate. Like, just that opening segment, I felt, gets to the heart of what you're talking about, Bob, of this kind of balance, where simultaneously you're opening up to this serious topic, but also hearkening back to not necessarily nostalgic sentiments, but personal sentiments of the way that a particular man was seen and engaged with those around him. So I wanted to mention that part of the writing as very interesting, and that definitely shines across throughout the whole text. Yeah.
Right. Do you have time for one quick story?
Of course, please.
Phil told me this. I don't know if it's actually in the book or not, but in the late 20s or 30s, John Lind was running St. Mary's Cement, and he gets home. It's around dinner time. His clothes were overalls and dusty and whatnot, and he didn't look all that prosperous. And he gets a knock on the door, and he would have had one of the biggest houses in St. Mary's, Ontario. And there's this Cadillac salesman knocks on his door. He's trying to sell Cadillacs door to door, and he looks at Johnny Lind and his overalls and the dust on them, and he thinks, "Oh, this is a waste of my time." And he basically is about to turn around, and Phil's grandfather says to him, "Well, what are you selling?" And the guy nonchalantly figures there's no there's probably no chance he's going to sell anything here. He gives him a quick, 30-second pitch. And Johnny Lynn turns to him and says, "Oh, okay, I'll take 2." And the guy just couldn't believe it.
I love that story. That's so great. Perfect example of don't judge a book by its cover, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that actually gets me to one of the last questions that I always like to ask people. And you have no obligation to do so, but is there a particular part of the book that you prefer? Like, what's your favorite part of the book? And if you want to read a part of the book in order to express that particular favorite part, then I always give chances to the authors to actually do that. And it gives a better sense to people of what the book is like and what kind of passages they can expect.
You want to start, Phil, or shall I?
You
Okay, one of the things I'm most proud of is the way we deal with the Indigenous questions. Phil has a friend who is actually a descendant of Quiche, and she helped us. She reviewed some of the stuff we wrote and whatnot. And Charlotte Gray, the great Canadian writer who wrote a fabulous book on the Klondike, she read the book, and on the back of the cover of the book, she even said something along the lines of, looking back, I wish I dealt with the Indigenous issue as well, sort of thing. So that's what I'm kind of proud of. One of the parts of the if you want me to read, I don't know, if you want me to read for 30 seconds, please. I can. It's on his way. It's on his way up. He's on the Yukon River, and they get to this place called Miles Canyon near Whitehorse.
Ooh.
And actually, you keep talking while I'm trying to find exactly where it is. Sorry, I should have had this.
Miles Canyon was a place where you had to go through to get up the river, and it was very, very, very turbulent.
Okay. Okay. So here it is. So the formidable canyon is about a mile long and only 50 feet wide. 50 feet, not much, with a large whirlpool spinning halfway through. Its walls push the water into the center, churning up roaring, foaming, lashing waves that would have created terror for anyone trying to navigate while preventing a boat from smashing into the hard balsite walls. And you got to remember, this isn't a boat; it's a raft. It's not exactly seaworthy. Johnny and John Christ were faced with a difficult choice. They could brave the white water with all their supplies on board and be through in minutes, or they could unpack the boat and portage around it, which would take days. Johnny makes no mention of the risk or even how he and Christ made the dreaded decision to roll the dice. Perhaps, like Hobson's choice, they concluded that in this case, choice was an illusion. It was worth the risk to get through in minutes. And yet Johnny was rather nonchalant in stating that they simply ran the canyon where many stampeders would later perish, as Tappan Abney and Jack London would both write. It must have been a harrowing 5 minutes for Johnny Christ. And yet he was such a modest man, he did not pump it up that it was such a big deal, which I'm reading this and I'm going, why are you not more nervous? Why aren't you bragging or something like that? Because it was quite an astounding decision to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember that passage very vividly. Phil, did you have any particular moment that you wanted to highlight as part of the book's overall impact?
I mean, just that my grandfather's character was not just low key, almost no key. He did not brag at any point in his life. He always had a feeling for the little guy, and he built a great legacy for himself in St. Mary's with the cement plant, the cement quarry, the tennis courts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it was nothing to do with him. It's a great, great guy.
And during the Depression, Patrick, at the grocery store in St. Mary's, he had an open line of credit. And if somebody couldn't afford their groceries, the grocer would put it on his account.
Interesting. So yeah, very much, the magnanimous part of this character shines through. And so very, very good point. But I always like to finish with one last question that I don't send to the authors. And this particular question is meant to kind of open up to new discussions and to get people to think further about the topic than perhaps we had time to discuss in this particular interview. But what didn't I ask in this interview? And what's the answer to that question? You can take a time to think about it, because it's not an easy question necessarily.
Well, you didn't ask about all the other characters, and we touch on the characters and we made this a conscious decision because these characters, Belinda Mulrooney, Big Alex McDonald, Soapy Smith, all these characters, we touch on them, but we don't. We focused more on the lesser known characters, the St. John Athertons, the couple from California. I forget their name, but they left with all their fortune as well, and started an oil company with their money.
The Berries.
The Berries. So, there was just so many characters. But one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on the less well known, A, Johnny Lind was less well known, but B, when you think about it, the greatest legacy or the lasting legacy of the Klondike is the ice cream treat, Klondike bars, and they are literally sugar coated. So how many of the stories about Soapy Smith and Belinda Mulrooney are true or not? So we decided, no, let's focus on Johnny and things that we actually know for sure happened.
Yeah, that's excellent. And Phil, did you have anything that you wanted to add that perhaps we didn't touch upon?
No, I think we touched upon it, but I said earlier, I'm interested in culture and how North Americans act, and what the found differences between U.S. and Canada. And considering how close Canada came in a number of instances to being overwhelmed by Americans all across the borders, I don't know how we did it, but we did it. And so far, you can argue about certain things that the government does, but generally speaking, it's a pretty good country, and people are pretty reasonably pleased with the country. Whereas in the United States, my God, every day mass shootings, etc., etc.
Well, thank you both so much for your time today and all the valuable information that you provided about the production of the book, the collections, and of course, this, as we say, unsung sourdough, right, of the Klondike. And we've been dealing with organizing this interview for many weeks now, but is the book already out? Can you let listeners know where they can find it, perhaps? And any extra information as to that?
It's on Amazon.ca or Amazon.com. It's in bookstores in Vancouver. I don't know whether has it arrived in Toronto and Montreal in bookstores yet? I don't know.
I've been in a bookstore in a while, so I don't know. Okay. To be perfectly honest. But quite possibly. Okay. But honestly, I can't encourage listeners enough to pick this up. It is a wonderful read. It's not particularly long, but it's packed with really good information, and anyone who's interested in the gold rush will be interested in this book. Bob, Phil, thank you so much for your time today. And I wish you all the best for any future collaborations and for the launch of this book.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you very much.